Hello, everyone, and welcome to an unusually punctual edition of the Next Big Pod. I actually think we're 1 minute early by my watch, which is a record for the group of us. And as you may have known from all the tweeting this week, we are very privileged to be joined by Charles Farrell, who is a writer, a former manager, and various other things within boxing, who's been in and around the sport for. Charles, forgive me if I'm overestimating your age here. It must be over 50 years.
Well, I'm 64, so I would say that I've been actively involved in the sport for 45, 46 years, and I've been watching the sport for 60 of those 64 years.
I'm sorry, I've been very rude with the first thing I said.
No.
In the ballpark.
I seem very. I think people mistake me, just assume I'm 80 or 90, but that's fine.
Very worldly, that's why.
Very worldly, yes.
So just before we kick off, this is going to be sort of hopefully a very in-depth interview with Charles, and we're going to be asking him about all sorts to do with his career in boxing, as well as the current landscape, as he has been a fan and sort of on the outside for about 15 years now, on and off. And just before we go, we're joined by Ainsley, Andy, and Alex. And if you've got any questions at all within the realms of politeness, stick them in the chat, and we'll do our best to get round to them. But I thought, Charles, if we could kick off with you talking about how you got your start in boxing, because we've listened to your Sesquipedalian pod many times, but some of the listeners may not have. So if you could fill them in, that would be great.
Of course. I started watching boxing when I was really just a very young kid, and I was lucky enough to be able to watch the kind of last golden age of television. So I saw great fighters, and what I found was that I had an aptitude for understanding what I was watching. It was a kind of inherent recognition of what I was seeing in front of me. So I started going to the gyms when I was a kid too, probably 10, 11 years old, something like that. And there were a lot of good local boxers. I'm from Boston, and Boston had good fighters. What my introduction to boxing came from gambling, which is something I did for a long time. People within the boxing community recognized that I could tell who was going to win fights, and often got information from being around gyms that was useful. So people would pay me percentages of bets that I would make on their behalf, and of course I'd bet for myself too. And that essentially was what brought me into boxing. Gambling brought me into boxing.
I'd like to point out at this stage, if I may, that Charles, I famously made a bet on Brandon Rios to knock out Tim Bradley and got a lot of grief for it. Charles and I were DMing at the time, and he completely supported my pick. So I just want to say that to cover my own back. But no, it's fascinating. So you were very much on the inside early on then, in terms of seeing how the fighters were preparing and that side of the sport that's really hidden to us now, despite technology, in theory, making it much more accessible.
Well, if we can discount my complete lack of preparation in the Rios suggestion, and mea culpa, I couldn't have been more wrong. There was no insider information. It was just me being wrong and being aggressively certain about my prediction. So, but yeah, what would happen is that, I with access to the gym and with inside information, you could get to the point where you could tell who was going to win fights almost all the time. Now, the myth about doing that, and I've alluded to this before, is that within the business, almost everybody can do that, and I'm sure you guys can all do it too. You can look at fighters and almost without exception, know who will win those fights.
I think, Charles, I believe in one of your articles you quoted that sort of within the business, within the sort of manager's circle of boxing, the guys will know who's going to win. I think you said 90% of the time was your estimation.
I believe that to be true, and honestly, I think that nowadays, a lot of the people who blog, I mean, and do it seriously and follow the fight game seriously, are very good at it too. What they don't have, and maybe this is the difference that will move them from 90% to 75%, is that they don't have people talking to them. And of course, that makes an enormous difference. If you have the fighters and the trainers talking to you, and more particularly, if you become aware of kind of the financial inducements that would make one fighter want to win, one fighter want to lose, then it becomes a pretty reliable thing to, barometer for who's going to win and lose. Now that said, and this is important, people who establish the odds, and nowadays if you're talking about legal betting, you're talking about Las Vegas in the United States, also know those things. And so the odds reflect those things. So it's harder to make a really good bet that where the odds are completely out of skew with the probability of something happening.
We often find, as sort of very small-time, gamblers who occasionally bet on fights over here, the guys on the pod often find that you only really get good value on a single fight when it's very much in the public eye, and the public might be swayed by the hype, or they might be not as kind of dedicated fans, so they might get carried away with the A side or the home fighter, and then you might be able to get good value based on the fact that most of them haven't seen the opponent before. But like you said, it's rare to find genuine value, because the markets, if something's wrongly priced, they tend to pick up on it very quickly.
I think yes, I think that's right. I mean, and as you say, really the only time that tends not to be true with the general public is if you're talking about an icon who clearly cannot fight anymore, and that's free money, and that happens once in a while. But I mean, as an example, when Muhammad Ali fought Larry Holmes, that's free money.
Yes, what were the odds for that fight, actually? Obviously we weren't around or watching the sport quite so much back then.
If memory serves, they were either 6-5 Ali or 6-5 Holmes. But, that was a bet where really the idea was to gather as much money as you and your family and everybody you ever knew in your life could put together and bet Larry Holmes. I mean, it was free money.
I'm trying to think of free money is the operative word, I think. I can remember and you can never quite tell with broadcasters because, and this guy in particular, because you never know if they're being completely impartial. But I can remember before the Mayweather-Pacquiao fight last year, Paulie Malignaggi, who was obviously working for Showtime and Mayweather's, media promoter de facto, talking about how if you bet Mayweather points, it's printing money. And he showed various betting slips where he put $100,000, $150,000. He put everything he had, basically, on Mayweather to win on points. And just kept saying, look, guys, I'm telling you, it is printing money. And that's the only example I can really think of that's similar. I don't know if the rest of the guys have got a similar example where you felt that a fight was so wrongly priced.
Well, the one that sticks out for me last year, especially, was the Zhu Shiming and that Roan fight. The odds for that were just astronomically sort of mispriced, I think. I mean, Zhu Shiming obviously had the backing of China and things like that, but he was just a massive favourite. You could get, I think, 4-1 on Amnat Roan before that fight, and up to 6-1 in the middle of the fight. And I just think that it was just crazy mispricing. And
it almost seemed like they knew something we didn't it? Yeah.
But then, if you look at, I know it's not signed or anything, but if you look at the proposed odds for Povetkin Wilder, Povetkin's 74 or something mental.
Yeah, which is great value for what at best a very close fight.
Yeah, that's a 50-50 fight at the very worst.
The last good example I can think of is actually the fight you were just talking about, the Tim Bradley, Brandon Rios. I actually had money on Bradley KO at 15-2.
But I still maintain that Bradley KO is never a good bet, just because he's not a puncher.
I agree with that, and looking at his record, you can tell that, and anybody that follows the sport knows it's not. But I don't know, it's just I had the day of that fight, I just had, call it gut instinct, and I thought I'll put some money on that, and it came in. I thought it was a good price, and I don't know, I just had something telling me that it was going to happen. So luckily I bet on it and got a small one, not great money, but a win's a win in it.
Yeah,
a win is a win.
I was convinced the other way. Sorry, Charles, go on.
Well, no, that's right. Winners. I was wrong about that for a couple of reasons, and then ultimately, if you're wrong, you're wrong. It's on you, of course. But I thought that Bradley had been beaten up so many times, had looked so bad. I am not a Teddy Atlas fan. I thought Teddy Atlas would do more harm than good, and it didn't occur to me that Rios had spent not a minute in training. I just thought he's a bigger, stronger guy, and Bradley is close to the end. But obviously, I was mistaken. But the fact that you saw that fight as a good bet is really very astute.
Maybe if we'd seen Rios training, we might not have been so sure. Yeah, like you said. Which actually brings me back. Sorry, we won't get hung up on Brandon Rios. It's not really worthy of your or our time, I don't think. But I know you've spoken in the past quite sort of, possibly most famously about the process of fixing fights, or weighing the odds in your favour to essentially fix a contest. And I don't know if you could talk to us a little bit about that again, from a layman who maybe thinks that boxing is completely innocent and it's always a fair contest.
Well, I mean, if you think that, if you're enjoying yourself, that's fine. But that means you're a viewer at the most primitive level of the sport, because boxing in various degrees, and this is a difficult subject because fight fixing runs a very wide gamut, and you can't confine fight fixing to a guy falling down when he's not hurt, and I mean there's a lot of fight fixing that exists in real fights, and probably the most high profile example that I can think of recently is Pacquiao Bradley 1, which clearly was a real fight, or primarily a real fight, but was I'm absolutely convinced predetermined ending, and there were a lot of reasons.
Sorry, Charles, just to interrupt. When you say it was a real fight, you mean that the participants themselves were not aware of the fix?
Ordinarily, now this is interesting because ordinarily, in a fixed fight, the loser is aware of the fix. The winner generally is not. There are exceptions to every rule, but generally the winner is not, so that he can go through the motions of really fighting. In this particular fight, I'm in my opinion, Bradley was unaware of what was going on, and Pacquiao was told. Basically, Pacquiao fought his own fight, but I thought pretty conspicuously took his foot off the accelerator a couple of times when he had Bradley in trouble. I think he understood that what was important was to go the distance, to dominate the fight, and to lose.
There's been a few things mentioned about Bob Arum before, and fighters who have sort of been a bit tough in negotiations about contract extensions, and that was around the time that Manny, I think he'd just signed a new contract, but he'd haggled over it for quite a while. So, do you think there's anything more in it, in sort of that element?
Retribution sort of thing.
Yeah.
No, I don't think that's it at all. I don't think it has. I think these are businessmen. I think that there's nothing personal about it. From what I understand, Pacquiao was burning through a tremendous amount of money and had money problems and had gambling problems and had an entourage problem. And I won't say much more about this, but the odds on that fight, I think, were 8-1 or something like that. And there was a lot of Asian money involved. So I think that at a lot of people who bet a lot of money to get $8 for one, and it's a very smart move. And it seems to me that one of the people who benefited from that wasn't, or let me word it differently. Timothy Bradley wasn't the only fighter in the ring who benefited from that win.
Well, I think there's a sort of less economic, but more of a kind of moral argument that Bradley was the real victim, because he got, he was talking about getting hate mail, and then he went out against Vodnikov 9 months later and was almost suicidal in the way he fought. And he's always said that he felt like he was he's been trying to dig his way out of a hole ever since, with the fans and with the boxing public.
Well, I mean, I can see it from that point of view. On the other hand, he got, officially speaking anyway, a very notable victory. He got a rematch that got him paid a lot, and he's about to have a rubber match that's going to get him paid a lot. So, being abused by the fans comes with the territory. I would say that if you look at everything on balance, Timothy Bradley did pretty well.
Would you say that, I can remember after the first fight, and sort of after the disgust and the anger had worn off, because to us at least, Pacquiao clearly won 9 or 10 rounds.
Right. Right.
And yeah, there was an extent of him taking his foot off the gas, as he had done in many fights before that, towards the sort of second half of his career, I suppose, when he seemed to lose the killer instinct. But I can remember thinking, as soon as the dust settled, thinking the winner is Arum, because they can have a trilogy now, and he can keep his two best welterweights in a divided sport. He can keep them fighting against each other, and it will be relevant because they have, Bradley won the first one, Pacquiao wins the second, then they need to have a rubber match to decide, and it just set up the whole trilogy straight away.
Well, I mean, I think that that's something that Arum probably put on the back burner. I mean, at this point, everyone was still thinking about Mayweather, of course, and they knew that a loss in terms of marketing that fight would have been difficult. But if Pacquiao wins the fight in front of, in the eyes of the world, I mean, I think 8 or 9 rounds is fair. He certainly didn't win fewer than that. He's still seen as the winner of the fight. I mean, in the court of public perception, he's the winner. He didn't take a loss there at all. So it doesn't hurt his marketability, and that's important. So you do so many things with a fight like that. You make a betting coup. You don't kill off the biggest fight in history. And on the back burner, you have this trilogy available. And so, it's sort of a way to keep money going in perpetuity. And, that it's smart boxing. It's not something that fans would like, but it's smart boxing. And that's another way that fights can be fixed. I remember when Canelo was about to fight Mayweather, I think I even wrote about this. I said, look, Mayweather's going to win this fight. It's going to be completely one-sided. He's just vastly too experienced, too talented. Canelo not only is too green for this kind of fight, he also doesn't have that kind of talent. But it will be a split decision or a majority decision. That's a fixed fight. Now, why is it fixed and how is it fixed? That's the issue, I would say. It's fixed because Canelo, in many ways, is the future of boxing in terms of marketability, the kind of money he will make down the line. If he loses a split decision or a majority decision, the option you have is you can create a narrative that allows him to actually look good in the loss. He just fought the best fighter in the world, a guy no one has ever beaten. He's a young kid. He was really competitive. He almost won the fight. Of course, none of that part of it's true, but it keeps him completely able to make huge paydays in the future. And of course, it also opens up the door for a rematch, possibly.
Yeah, it's not a humiliation. Yeah,
it's not a humiliation, and that is a fixed fight.
Sorry, go on.
No, again, both fighters are fighting all out. They're doing whatever they can do. all you have to do is buy one judge.
Yeah, and my lasting memory from that fight, I think it was one of the Showtime post-fight bits, and it was in the Canelo's dressing room, and Richard Schaefer just stood there saying, "Oh well, the one call was a draw, it was a close fight," and then they sort of left, and it's like, "Oh, where's he got that from?"
And they've got that fallback, haven't they? Straight away, well, they can say, well, it wasn't a whitewash. Look at the cards. Yeah.
Straight away, that's the first thing he said. He walked in the dressing room. Was like, well, one call was a draw, and then he's so good, but it was a close fight.
Right.
And you have to think, Charles, on that fight, because I can remember I get a lot wrong, but I can remember thinking there is just no way, bar a freak incident or miracle punch, that Floyd is going to lose. And I think there's a case that he won every single round. I think I scored it 10-2, maybe 11-1. And I just remember thinking he's going to absolutely dominate. Canelo's got nothing for him. He's far too green. And like you said, he's just, at that stage, he was still fighting much smaller opponents and really hadn't been tested. And I actually thought he lost to Austin Trout in the fight before that.
Yeah,
I scored that for Austin Trout and just thought that was a complete robbery. And yeah, like you said, it was a way for Canelo to lose, but grow from the experience. Whereas in reality, he was embarrassed.
That's exactly right. And you saw in his face after the fight, it was very clear that he understood that he lost. And
I thought there was a stage when he actually wanted to quit in that fight. I thought it was about the 9th or 10th round, and he looked in his face. He looked completely dejected, like he couldn't do anything. And his corner was saying to him, no, keep going. But to me, he looked like if they'd thrown the towel in, I don't think he would have complained at all.
That sounds right to me too. Yes, I agree with you. But that's a fixed. So that's one end of the spectrum of how fights can be fixed. That's and then there's the more direct fight fixing, and of course I've done plenty of that over the years, and that's where you pay someone to lose, and you can even fine tune how you pay them to lose.
Can I ask before we go into the sort of I guess that would be the kind of traditional way people would perceive fights to be fixed, in terms of you tell a guy, right, you're going down in X round or whatever it is, and we all know the stories of the mob, Jake LaMotta and all those guys who were told you have to do this at this particular time or you'll be in trouble. You've stated before in articles that you can make an ethical case in favor of fixing fights, and I think that's a really interesting statement, and if you could elaborate on that, that would be fantastic.
I can make an argument that I believe is ethical. I don't know that everyone will agree with me, because we have to start on the premise that people who are watching and are paying their money to see an evenly contested fight are going to be cheated. So let's acknowledge that, and I will acknowledge that. The ethical argument that I would make about fixing fights has to do with damage done to fighters. What their life trajectory is, what they come from, what they're likely to go through, where they're likely to wind up, and the neurological damage that they will almost inevitably sustain. Virtually no fighter goes through anything longer than, I would say, anyone who's fought 10 professional fights or more is going to wind up damaged for the rest of their lives. Now, there are exceptions to every rule, of course, and you could point to them and you could say, well, look, there's Bernard Hopkins, there's George Foreman. Those guys are genetically very, very lucky in some ways. They fought in certain ways that allowed them not to take punishment, but those are the exceptions. As a manager, I felt I had two obligations. And again, I don't want to be simplistic about this. My being in boxing had a lot of complex reasons, and not all of them were altruistic. So to be clear. But being around fighters, and I think maybe you guys have probably been around fighters some, or maybe even a lot, you see what happens to them. No one can be in the dressing room with a heavyweight who's been through a 10-round fight. I don't care who he is. I don't care whether the fighters can fight or not, and not notice that the guy looks like he's been in a car accident. Doesn't happen. That's serious damage. So my feeling was always that in a system a game that's slanted against fighters, and it really is slanted against fighters in every way imaginable, and knowing that they start with nothing, and knowing that whatever they earn is going to be taken from them, and knowing that they're going to emerge from boxing permanently damaged, and it's also degenerative. No matter how bad it is at the start, it gets worse and worse. My obligation was to minimize the damage, and the way I knew to do that best was to, when it was expeditious, to fix fights, and I completely stand behind that.
Do you feel that you were in the minority in terms of someone who would resort to doing that, or consider that an ethical option from their corner, or was it widespread?
Well, I mean, I think you have to differentiate between whether it's widespread because there are good business reasons for doing it, which there are, or from my point of view, I mean, let me again say that I certainly didn't think that, I certainly had business reasons in mind too. So, you know, I was thinking money, I was thinking business, I was thinking of moving my fighters forward. But I think that there's a tremendous amount of that gets done. Now, what the ethical component to that is, I can't say. You know, I don't know whether people inside boxing really think in those terms primarily. And again, I'm out of boxing, so it's easy for me to say this to you, say, well, my concern is ethical, and it is now that I don't make money from boxing, or you know, I make money from writing about boxing occasionally, but a large part of my feeling about fight fixing has to do with having witnessed at very, very close quarters the effects of what happens to anyone who has a professional career in boxing.
So it's really, it's a case of, it's ethical within your, what's the word I'm looking for? Within your kind of corner of the sport and your microclimate, I suppose, of your fighters, and protecting them and looking after them and keeping that habitat going. It's ethical, but you don't think about maybe the guy in another orbit who is sort of on the receiving end, or potentially damaging his career by maybe being pressured into taking a dive or whatever it is.
Let's talk about being pressured into taking a dive, okay? Because I think there's a kind of cinematic picture that's attached to people taking dives, and I think there's a disproportionate assumption that fighters are pressured into taking dives. I won't say that never happens, but I can confidently say that it seldom happens. So the person taking the dive is complicit, and you know, whether it helps to hurt.
They have a choice. Sorry, you're saying that.
I believe that, yes. I can't say that that's true all the time, but I would say it's true an overwhelming majority of the time. And further, if a guy says, look, I don't want to do that, I don't feel comfortable taking a dive, unless he's a marquee fighter, you know, who's not fungible, you can't slot in somebody else's name for his. There's another guy, probably in the same
have no
gym.
leverage, do they? Yeah.
Yeah.
I see what you mean. I can actually remember in a previous article you wrote, it was possibly on one of the radio shows, you described a time when a rival manager who you had reached an agreement with for his fighter to lose in a certain way, tried to sort of pull a switch on you and replace it with an unknowing fighter. And I can remember the process of you having to convince them. If you could talk about that, that was fascinating.
That's not exactly what happened.
Okay, sorry.
If we're referring to the same incident, but let me tell you what the incident is, and you can let me know if we're talking about the same thing. I had fixed the fight for in this particular instance, I won't talk about who the fighter is, but I had bought a 1-round knockout, a fast knockout, for the people I was representing. It was not my fighter per se, but it was some people who I was looking out for. And the matchmaker, who had been paid to produce that outcome, wound up getting a preliminary fighter who had no talent, who he assumed would lose in the first round, and he pocketed all the money. He didn't give any money to the kid who was scheduled to lose, and he didn't tell him anything. So what he thought would happen was that he was going to get lucky, that my guy, who was coming in from New York and to a lot of fanfare, was going to wipe out this kid who couldn't fight at all in the first round, and nobody would be the wiser. And I'm not quite sure what intuition, I had a feeling about it, and so I questioned the fighter and ascertained that he hadn't been made aware of what he was supposed to do. So I fixed that.
You came to an agreement, as it were.
Say that again, please.
You came to an agreement. Yeah.
We did come to an agreement. Yeah.
Andy, yeah, you jump in, mate.
Yeah. So obviously, we could assume there's a lot of different ins and outs, the whole process. So roughly, how would you go about fixing a fight? So what would be the rough process from start to finish? Because obviously, I assume it's not all the same. I assume in some cases people approach you, but if you were asked, say, to do that, what would the approach be?
I wish I could give you one answer, but there isn't one, because here are some of the things I might do. Right. The easiest way to do it is to go to a gym that you know well, where there are guys who deliver opponents, and everybody in boxing knows who they are, and they're reliable. You got to understand that if they tell you their guy is going to lose, he has to lose, because that's how they make their living. So it's a pretty fail-safe idea to do it that way. So that's one of the things you'll do. You go and you'll talk to somebody you know, and this happens at every level of boxing, surprisingly, and you'll tell them exactly what you want. You tend to talk in code, but you get your message across, and that's one way to do it. But another way to do it is you can fix referees to stop fights fast. You can fix cornermen to stop fights fast. You can fix judges so that if the fight goes the distance, you've got the decision. And you don't even have to do that stuff overtly all the time. Let me give you one further example. If you're fighting in small towns, and you're the team, you're the side, you're the blue corner, right? You're bringing in all the winners. You're bringing in people who often are known to the fight people in these small towns. So they're kind of taken by it to begin with. So you include them. You include them in all your activities. You make sure you know their names. You make sure that they hang out with the fighters. They're already on your side. And you let them know. And this happens. This is how this works in really high-end boxing, probably more than anywhere else. That this good time, this thing that they're getting, will dry up if your fighters don't win. And you could even say to them, if you know them pretty well, look, we really need the decision on this one. And you're going to get it. Now, one of the things that people talk about when they're talking about judges in big fights, high-profile fights, coming to seeing fights in ways that are completely different than everybody else who's watching. You think, how is that even possible? I mean, this guy's been watching fights for 50 years, and everybody in the world has got fighter A winning, and he's got fighter B winning.
Yeah.
He's living in a town where a good part of his income, not a great part, but a significant part of his income, his ability to travel, his ability to take the benefits of the business, and a lot of good times, a lot of stuff that's done on the periphery, it dries up. It's gone. If you don't get the decision, and everybody who's around the business a while knows what that decision is supposed to be. So he's the designated guy who makes sure that decision gets done the way it's supposed to get done. And nobody even has to tell him anything. He knows.
Yeah, so, I think, like you touched on with the judges and the refs, you only need to obviously pay one off. So, if we look obviously at the top level, I know it's a bad example, but say Mayweather, Pacquiao, the amount of money they were both earning. If you look at the amount of money that obviously Kenny Bayless or the judges in that fight are getting, is ridiculously minuscule in comparison. So, with the amount of money surrounding the fight, such as that, do you think there needs to be more to just monitor what the officials are doing? Because obviously, with that amount of money involved, if they're not taking in that amount of it, obviously they're more susceptible, you would say, to.
And sometimes I think it's quite shocking how little a referee is paid. I can remember a championship fight with Lawrence Cole in Texas, where I think he got $100 for the night's work, and you just think, you're surrounded. This is on HBO. The fighters are earning hundreds of thousands of dollars each. The scope for corruption is just enormous.
It is, and there are referees who everybody used to point to, who were Don King referees. Joey Curtis was a Don King referee. Richard Steele was a Don King referee. I mean, I don't know if you guys remember, but toward the end of his refereeing career, Richard Steele couldn't walk into the ring without being booed.
Was that following the Chavez Taylor fight, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, which I always obviously, being on Twitter, talking with other fans around the world, there's a lot of Mexican American boxing fans, and they rightly love Chavez, and very few of them will accept that was a fix. But to me, it just seems so obvious that he didn't. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, whether that's considered a fix in itself, but it just seemed like they were going to do everything they could to make sure Chavez won that fight one way or the other.
Right. No, I don't. Obviously, the fight was real. I mean, we can,
Yes.
But Richard Steele was a Don King referee, so he referees with his eyes open. He referees looking to what the possibilities are, and he got unbelievably lucky at the very end of the fight. There was no possibility for Chavez to throw another punch. He could not have hit Taylor one more time. And you're talking about a veteran referee. Taylor is in the corner. Those red lights are flashing. Nobody can miss them. That's 10 seconds left to go in the fight.
He's inches away from the light, isn't he, as it's flashing in his face?
Inches away from the light. Chavez is in the furthest neutral corner. It's a physical impossibility for him to come across the ring and hit Taylor another time. Can't be done. To me, that's a fixed fight.
Is it true to say, because we have some examples that we'll run by you a bit later, and obviously if you don't want to comment on what you think, that's completely understandable, but we sometimes notice, or perhaps we only notice as fans, when a fight is obviously fixed. And do you think that's, or when something is obviously wrong with a particular fight or a particular finish? And is that almost a case of someone has made a mistake that it's so obvious? I'm thinking of Wilder versus Malik Scott or something, where a knockout is so unconvincing, or a stoppage is just so inexplicable from a referee. That almost seems like a time when where they've made a mistake, and it should be much more subtle and much more controlled than that.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly what happened. With Malik Scott, he as boxing itself has deteriorated, and it has deteriorated terribly over the years, and as trainers have gotten worse and worse. Things like fight fixing has deteriorated as well. Carrying fighters, there were gradations that existed that no longer do, and a guy like Malik Scott has no experience with being hit and getting knocked out. I mean, one of the things that was pretty clear in that fight is that he was unwilling to take a shot to make the knockout look legitimate, and so it looked horrible. But yeah, I mean, I think that
that seemed to me like a bad acting job from him. Yeah,
it was. That's exactly what it was. It was a bad acting job. I mean, I can tell you acting jobs that I thought were great, and I can tell you why. I mean, I think that If you'll remember Mike Tyson against, and now I'm drawing a blank on his name. He's in jail. He'll be in jail for the rest of his life. He's in New Orleans. Clifford Etienne.
Oh yes, yeah.
Okay, first round knockout, and Etienne is hit hard on the chin, gets knocked out. It's a real punch. The knockout's real. Etienne puts his chin out there. You know, that's the deal. I'm a guy who doesn't have a lot of options. I'll take that shot. I'll get knocked out for $500,000. You know, that's something that Malik Scott wasn't willing to do or able to do.
We had one recently in the UK, about a year ago actually, and it wasn't broadcast in the US. I would be very surprised if you'd seen the fight, but it basically involved a stay busy building up to a big arena show. And you know, in the UK we love our big arena stadium fights.
Right.
It was two guys from the same hometown who were scheduled to fight in August, and it had been building up for about a year. And one of them had a warm-up fight in, I think it was March or April, against a guy who'd been a former world title challenger, a former sort of European level fighter, was about 35, had not had a significant win in years, was completely irrelevant in the division. And in the second round, this guy threw a very, very soft hook, and it caught him behind the ear, and it completely cleaned the A-side fighter out. He was absolutely all over the place. He got up to his feet, but he was you know, like Bambi on ice, as the phrase goes. For the next 2 or 3 rounds, the fighter had knocked him down, barely threw a punch, because you could just see that he knew he'd fucked up, and he shouldn't have landed that punch, because that would wreck the whole stadium fight if he lost. And then the B-side fighter retired on his stool with what he claimed was a burst eardrum at the end of the 5th round, and it was just so blatant that it was a predetermined fight, like you said. And I'll send you the link separately, and you can watch it. It's not a particularly high-level fight, but it was a really obvious example where even the guys who were fans of the fighters involved would say, in disgust, that was a fix.
Sure, no, that happens a lot. I mean, I think one of the things that maybe gets overlooked sometimes is a lot of times these A-side fighters aren't really very good, and so they get tapped on the chin by the opponent who doesn't expect anything to happen, and then they have to deal with the fallout of having a guy who's about to get knocked out on them, and they have to do whatever they
have to prevent it. Yeah,
they have to use all their skill.
I thought a fantastic example of that was Keith Thurman against Collazo last summer, when Collazo landed that body shot and Thurman just completely buckled, and then Collazo retired with a mysterious injury in the corner the next round. And I know that you're not a particular Thurman fan, but I can remember thinking that was very suspicious as well. In just that Collazo just didn't press the advantage when he'd hurt him, and you think that is a fighter's instinct. When they can tell they've hurt their opponent, a fighter at any level will smell blood and rush after them. And for some reason, the opponent in this case decided to, stay away and not really throw any punches, despite Thurman being clearly hurt. And I thought that was another very obvious example of a predetermined outcome, as it were.
Very obvious, yes, very. Yeah.
On this topic, it reminds me of a story that you've said before on another podcast about when you managed Leon Spinks and when you wished that you would fix the fight. Fix the outcome almost, because you weren't expecting. I forget the other guy's name, but he was obviously a complete nobody. But when he obviously really hurt Leon, could you go into that story a bit more?
Sure. The fighter you're referring to is John Carlo, who had never fought before.
Yes.
John Carlo was a trainer. He trained one of my fighters, a very talented heavyweight named Fernelli Felice, who I had high hopes for. I had been negotiating to have Leon fight in China against Larry Holmes, and that would have been a good money fight for Leon at that stage. And Holmes was somebody I trusted, because he's a very humane guy and he's got all kinds of talent, and he would have not destroyed Leon, and I would have done my part to make sure that nobody wasted too much time. I had hired a guy to fight Leon I booked a fight for him in D.C. And I'd hired a guy to lose to him, and the guy's CAT scan didn't come up right, and so the commission didn't allow him, and I had to substitute this other guy, John Carlo, who was just a friend of mine. Very, very tough guy. I mean, it's a guy who none of us would want to have to meet on the street, but who had never fought before in his life. And we made all of the arrangements, and I faked a record for him, which was hard work, and we even did call-in shows, but John was a friend of mine, the day before the fight talked about it, and he said, well, what happens if I win? And, again, we were both laughing. And I said, well, that's not going to happen because you've never fought before, and as diminished as Leon is, he still was once the heavyweight champ of the world, and more than that, you're going to not be able to deal with the pressure of being in front of thousands of people. It's very draining, and you're going to be exhausted 30 seconds into the fight. And I said this incredibly stupid thing. I said, if you can beat him, beat him. He shouldn't be fighting. And John essentially knocked him out with the first punch he threw.
The fight's actually on YouTube, remarkably, for such a small hall show. I don't know if you're aware, but we watched it the other day. It's a really nasty punch.
It was such a nasty punch, and what was interesting about it is the people in the arena, and most conspicuously the referee, went into a kind of suspended animation when it landed, as if nobody believed it. And so instead of doing what anyone should have done, which is stopping the fight, it went on and on and on, and we couldn't get the referee's attention, and it was just it was a nightmare. It was a terrible experience. But that's an instance when it would have been ethical and smart to have fixed the fight.
And yeah, you presume too much, as it were. Quite reasonably, I think, that a guy who'd never fought before wouldn't be able to knock out a former world champion, but he did it somehow.
Well, right, I presume too much, and the thing is, it was a mistake where I allowed history, and maybe to some degree a love for the sport, to supersede prudent business practices. I mean, there was really no justifiable reason for not taking that last step. Why not dot all the T's, cross all the T's, dot all the. That sounds like I've been fighting for too long. It was pretty inexcusable on my part.
Can I just ask, going back to, you mentioned Larry Holmes a moment ago, and it reminded me of something you had previously said. And I know you never managed Larry or anything, but you mentioned that he was, you would have been confident that he wouldn't have beaten Leon up too badly. And I can remember a phrase you used, which, where fighters are skillful enough not to hurt their opponents. And obviously that sounds backwards to the average fan, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what you mean by that.
Sure. A really good fighter, really experienced fighter, knows how to pull his punches, knows when to ease up, knows a lot about punch placement, knows to hold and clinch and do things that look aggressive when in fact they're a method of protecting the person who they're taking care of. So somebody like Holmes can look like he's destroying you, but in fact he's carrying you. Now, a guy, at one point, after Leon had lost to John Carlo, my friend Vin Vecchione was in the process of building Peter McNeely back up as a local attraction. And he said, well, how about if he fights Leon? And I said, I can't do that because Leon really can't take another punch. It's not a good idea. But I'll make you a deal. If you tell Peter only to throw body shots, I'll pull Leon out at the end of the first round with a broken rib, and that's fine. And Vin said to me, well, Peter's not that talented, which means that in the heat of battle with the crowd and whatever else was going on, he didn't have the ability to not throw punches full out, and he would hurt somebody. That's what I mean about being skillful enough to not hurt someone.
Okay. It kind of it sounds it's a form of genius, I suppose, but it sounds completely, on the surface, completely counterintuitive to everything you think a fighter would know. You think they'd be a wrecking ball who'd go in there and walk through walls to hurt the opponent, but I can see exactly what you mean. You mentioned Vin Vecchione, and we've been talking about this in our group chat preparing for the interview for a few days now, about the McNeely Tyson fight, and I don't believe you were directly involved in that, but I know you've got some interesting stories about the way Vecchione guided McNeely to that shot, and obviously what happened after 89 seconds.
Well, the method that Vin used with Peter was seriously old school, matchmaking. It almost doesn't exist anymore. And let me amend that. That's not quite right. It still exists, but it exists with people who have got money to spend. The miracle in this particular instance is that Vecchione had no money, so he was able to manufacture a career through careful matchmaking, through making deals. I mean, through just being cautious and building this guy up one fight at a time and keeping him active. Very, very difficult to do. And the way that McNeely, let me backtrack slightly, walked into that particular fight. I had a little bit to do with it. I certainly had nothing to do with it directly, but I'm the person who brought Vecchione to Al Braverman, who was Don King's director of boxing, and it was he who made the match. So I did have some participation, although minimal participation. But the idea was that Tyson was getting out of prison, and Tyson was really not a fighter at all anymore. He was terribly overweight, and he was not motivated, and he was deteriorating. And you needed to put him in with somebody who had no chance of beating him. I know there were ideas floated around with having him win the title from Oliver McCall in his first fight back, because McCall was someone you could do business with. And there was at one point McNeely was supposed to win the title from McCall so that Tyson could win the title in his first fight back, and that didn't happen.
Yeah, how would that have happened? I can't see McNeely beating McCall on any day of the week.
Well, I mean, not without McCall's cooperation.
Okay.
But I mean, McCall's an interesting character. I mean, McCall, I'm absolutely certain, lost the title to Frank Bruno on orders. I think he could have knocked Frank Bruno out anytime he wanted, and didn't do it. But that's neither here nor there. But the idea was that...
sorry, just before you go on, Oliver McCall is actually someone we had lined up for later.
Yeah.
Ainsley, do you want to jump in?
So, it was just something about the Lewis fight. The infamous Lewis fight, the second one. So, that was never really explained, the way he just sort of lost his head and quit. Do you think there's anything more sinister behind that?
No, I don't. I don't think... No. McCall had been in rehab. He had only just recently gotten out of rehab. He was in the process of going through a nervous breakdown. And, that fight, I think, is exactly what it seemed to be. It was a guy having a nervous breakdown in the ring. You know, and what's interesting to me, and this is probably worth noting, Lennox Lewis was scared to death of him. Even as he was standing there crying with his hands down, Lennox Lewis never really tried to get rid of him. I mean, he was afraid to throw a punch.
McCall had an unbelievable chin, didn't he? I mean, for a start.
Oh my God, yes, yeah. And he could really punch, and he brought his punch with him late into the rounds, and he could hit with either hand. Just a very dangerous guy. But he also a guy who was, you couldn't entirely know would do what you expected him to do.
Okay, so rewinding slightly, so McCall and McNeely falls through, and then you see an opportunity involving the recently freed Tyson to talk to Vecchione and Al Braverman.
Right. I'm very, very good friends with Braverman to begin with. You know, we spent a lot of time together, and I consulted with him quite a bit when he was doing matchmaking.
Oh, sorry. For some of our younger or less experienced listeners, Al Braverman was Don King's matchmaker, I believe.
Technically, he was called as director of boxing, but he was one of his matchmakers, and I think he was probably, you know, his most trusted matchmaker, and had been with him the longest. He's, you know, he and Don Albaum were the people who brought King into boxing to begin with.
Okay, and you approached him regarding a potential McNeely Tyson meeting.
Well, actually, I started out by trying agitating on behalf of Mitch Green. You know, that's the
for a rematch.
For a rematch, yeah. This is sort of an interesting story. Obviously, you know, I represented Green, so it was in my interest to make that fight, and there was enough notoriety from their street fight so that I thought that could be maneuvered into a pretty good marketing approach. And I worked something out with Braverman. I said, well, look, can I get Mitch into the place where Tyson's being held, you know, the youth center in Indiana where he's serving out his prison sentence. You know, can you make that happen? He said, yeah, we could do that, but what do you have in mind? And I said, well, look, you know, people would be very interested to know what Mitch Green has got to say to Mike Tyson. And he said, okay, well, what would he say to Mike Tyson? I said, well, he wouldn't say anything to Mike Tyson. He'd punch him. And it would be broken up before anything happens, and by the time Tyson gets out of prison, it's the only fight that people will be interested in. And it was actually something that we were considering doing for a while. And the reason it didn't happen, I'm not sure if this is the only reason, but a primary reason, was because Mitch Green asked me how much money he was going to make. And I told him, I don't know, you know, $1 million, whatever it is, $1 million. And he said, how much is Tyson going to make? And I said, I don't know. And he said, is he going to make more than me? And I said, yeah, he's going to make more than you. And Mitch said, I'm not going to do anything to promote that motherfucker. And I could not talk him out of it.
Genuine rivalry from years earlier boiling over again.
Right. But I mean, it was funny because Mitch Green his career was over. He had no money, and and of course the funny thing is, and I didn't say this to anyone at the time, Mike Tyson was no longer a real fighter, and Mike Tyson was a guy at that point who would be discouraged if he didn't knock out his opponent within 3 or 4 rounds. And one thing Mitch Green could do is he could go rounds. He had a great chin, and I don't know what would have happened, but it was not, by the end of his career, Mike Tyson lost to fighters who certainly weren't as good as Mitch Green. So that was sort of in the back of my mind. But anyway, it didn't happen. And Vecchione and Braverman knew each other from years before anyway. They had kind of a slightly contentious relationships, but they got along. And McNeely was perfect in the sense that he wouldn't present any problem to Tyson at all. I mean, it just couldn't happen. He had a good record. He was white, which in a racist business means a lot, especially after movies like Rocky. And if the unthinkable happened and he managed to somehow win, he would be an incredibly hot prospect, and the rematch would be astronomical. So it was a kind of no-lose proposition for everybody.
And McNeely was undefeated going into that, wasn't he, I believe?
No, he had one loss. He lost to a guy who was actually had been my driver. It's a strange story, and I warned Vecchione away from that fight. It was a guy named Stanley Wright, who was 6'11.5" and about 270 pounds, and was really not a good fighter at all, but was a big guy and had a little bit of power, although, again, he had no way of delivering it. And what wound up happening was that Wright, who was a guy who was discouraged pretty easily when he was fighting, when he fought McNeely butted him in the first round, moved up, got under his nose and butted him and broke his nose. And Wright became furious, and he came back to the corner and he said, "That's it, I'm not going anywhere." And he wound up winning on a late round TKO. So, in fact, McNeely did have that one loss on his record, which got spun, in a way that didn't do him any real damage.
No, and obviously he made fantastic money against Tyson for 89 seconds work.
He did.
Yeah.
He did.
I think Andy wanted to ask you something if he's unmuted. Andy, you there?
Yeah, Charles, just going back to how you came to manage Charles Green and doing a little bit of research into Mitch Green, sorry. Just what I've come up with, correct me if I'm wrong, but he quite a good chin. I believe he was only ever knocked out on one occasion. Quite decent power as well. And how far do you think he could have went? From what I can pick up from it is he didn't live a life outside the ring. He was a bit
wild.
A bit wild, should I say? A bit too keen on the pleasures and the wonders of life, basically. Just to pick up your thoughts on that, if that's okay.
Well, he was an interesting guy. He came from an incredibly disadvantaged background, but he had a lot of talent. I don't know how big a puncher he was, but the chin was very, very real. I've never seen him. I've never seen him hurt ever by anybody, including a really good version of Mike Tyson. And he was definitely wild. I mean, he liked his drugs, and but the problem with him was that he was really sort of uncontrollable. I think he probably could have made a lot of money in boxing and maybe could have gone pretty far in it. I mean, I think by today's standards, he'd certainly be a world champion. I mean, you see the guy right now. There's maybe one heavyweight who can really fight, but he was, every single thing that we tried to do together, he would undermine. I mean, he didn't do the Tyson fight because it wasn't enough money. We had a fight that we could have made for him for Riddick Bowe, and he didn't take that one either for roughly the same reasons. I'll give you an example. When I first started to become friendly with him, the way I met him didn't have to do with boxing. It had to do with wrestling. I was friends with a guy named Lou Thez. And Lou Thez, I don't know if any of this will mean anything to you, was a matchmaker for a guy named Antonio Inoki, who was a Japanese wrestler and promoter.
Are you talking about the Lou Fesley, one of the most famous wrestlers ever? That
Yes,
guy?
sir. Yes,
Unbelievable.
sir.
Unbelievable.
Unbelievable. And an unbelievable guy. Just an incredible guy. But he was working with Inoki, and what they were trying to do is get American ex-heavyweight champions over there to work programs with Inoki.
That's right, because he actually was termed it shoot fighting, because did he not actually fight, was it Muhammad Ali or something like that in a shoot fight? And he basically went on the ground and refused to do anything but throw kicks.
Well, I don't think it was supposed to be a shoot fight. And I guess it turned into one because neither guy trusted the other. But it was supposed to go to a split draw. That's what I'm told. I don't know if, again, I don't have really great inside information about this, but what I'd always been told was, because it was being held in Tokyo and it was essentially Inoki's promotion, it was supposed to go the distance. Two of the judges were supposed to call it a draw, and one was supposed to give it to Inoki. And Inoki was afraid that Ali was going to, was not going to honor the script, and so he got on his back so he couldn't be hit, and just kicked up at Ali's legs all night. So I'm told. But he wanted to beat American heavyweights, ex-American heavyweights, and I think that's probably. I think he even fought Leon at one point. Not when I knew Leon, but I'm pretty sure he did.
I know a bit about that because I used to be really into wrestling, and Inoki he's known as a kind of egomaniac that always wanted to prove how tough he was. So obviously that's why he was wanting to fight boxers. That's amazing. That's just crazy stuff.
It is crazy. Well, it's funny. Ironically, I know something about Inoki because many years ago, for a while, I was friends with Walter Kowalski, who was called Killer Kowalski. And he told me that when he went to Japan the first time and worked with Inoki was so paranoid that Walter had to tell him when to pin him, because he was so concerned about being double-crossed, to having someone shoot on him, that you had to, if you were an American, you had to assure him that nothing was going to happen to him. And Walter said it was embarrassing because he'd fall onto his back and wait, and Inoki would just stand there. And he said he had a stage whisper, let's wrap it up, let's go home.
So, were you saying Mitch? Sorry, I'm not really much of a wrestling buff. Were you saying Mitch Green was involved in wrestling at one stage? Or?
Well, he was going to be. And this is a long-winded way of telling you the kind of guy he is. I was talking to Thez about working a program, having Mitch work a program with Inoki, because I thought Mitch will be great in Japan. He's just a perfect sort of monster figure that the Japanese fans will love. He's big and he's loud and he's colorful, and and he's believable. He's got street credibility. He's got tough guy bona fides. He's got all kinds of things you can work with. And Green wouldn't do it because he said, "Do I have to lose?" And I said, "Yeah, of course you have to lose. They're not bringing you over there to beat their number one guy." And he said, "I ain't going to do that." And he said, "What happens if anybody sees me? Anybody I know sees me?" And and that was sort of consistently. I tried saying, "Well, this is acting. This is if you were in a movie, if I got you into a movie and someone shot you in the movie, you wouldn't say, no, man, I'm not going to sell that. I'm not, that's a fake bullet. I'm not falling down. You'd fall down. This is the same thing." And there was nothing I could do to convince him to do it. He said I'm sorry again?
Bravado really got the better of him.
Yeah, it did. It did. It's still, I think, a a major factor, a major component of his overall makeup. I think he just is obsessed with his image as a tough guy. I mean, when he goes to Rikers Island, he calls himself the King of Rikers Island, which is a prison in New York. And I don't doubt that he is, that he's treated very well. I mean, he likes going there. He enjoys himself. But this has all been to his detriment, I think, in the long run, because he hasn't had an easy life.
Do you think I can remember reading your piece about Mitch Green and about him getting shot in a sort of tussle on the street, and the one thing that stuck out to me was that maybe in the modern era, when people are perhaps on a bit of a tighter leash and there's more scrutiny from the media and the public, maybe someone like Mitch Green would have done a bit better because he wouldn't have had enough rope to hang himself, if you know what I mean.
Well, or also the other thing is, if you were able to fight in this era, if you somehow the Mitch Green who I knew could, resurface as he was then now, maybe it wouldn't matter, what he. I mean, it's possible that no matter what he did, it would work to his benefit in terms of marketing. Maybe there's, I mean, because in terms of the things he's done to other people, they're pretty minor, so I think he might have a real fan following now, and he might do very, very well. And I can certainly see him, a young Mitch Green would have had no problem whatsoever with Wilder or with I'm trying to
Charles Martin.
Charles Martin, who's not even a beginner. So even guys like Chigaev, who are old, probably really wouldn't have done very well with him.
We were saying the other day that even the 90s, which I'm sure at the time was considered a watered-down version of the 80s and the 70s, the heavyweights who were sort of gatekeepers, fringe contenders then, would probably be picking up belts now. It's really degraded that much.
Well, I mean, think about it. The guys who King had in his stable, who were really just used as chess pieces back then, guys with no futures at all. They were sort of interim heavyweight champs just as a way of keeping, things available for Tyson. You're talking about Greg Page, Tony Tubbs, Tony Tucker. Try and imagine the guys who are holding titles or are in the top 10 now competing with those guys. I can't do it. It seems to me that they're a completely different level of fighter.
Yeah, it's a real shame. I mean, one of the reasons people are saying the heavyweight division is very interesting at the moment, I think, is because they're all equally terrible now, or they're all equally flawed, which is great because it means you can't really predict what's going to happen next. But at the same time, you look at the standard and think, okay, none of these guys would have had a prayer back in the golden era, as you put it.
Well, and that's not even the golden era. It's I don't know, the bronze era or something like that. I mean, if you go back an era before that to Ali's prime, they get even more dangerous.
Guys like Shavers, never winning a title, and then you've got Chigaev as a champion at the age of 40 or whatever he is, and
exactly right. I mean, can you imagine what someone like Shavers would do to anybody fighting today?
Can I ask, actually, this leads on really, really well to one of probably my favorite article that you've written, and on the subject of sort of the degradation of traditions within boxing. Your article about the Black Code and the kind of almost extinction of the Black Code today. It was absolutely fascinating, and I don't know if you could. It's a very complicated subject, but imagine that we're not familiar. If you could sort of sum it up, what you mean by the Black Code, that would be fantastic.
Well, first of all, thank you for your very generous appraisal of the piece. Black Code for me is an idiom of fighting that probably developed. It developed at the turn of the 20th century, and you know, existed for approximately, its heyday was close to 50 years. And it involved a rotating group of very, very talented black fighters who understood that in order to make a living, they had to be very, very busy. They had to be able to fight all the time. They weren't going to get championships no matter what. It just wasn't going to happen. There were no forums available for them to do that. That they were going to have to fight the toughest guys imaginable all the time. That they would probably have to fight them many, many times. And so this group of fighters and their trainers learned techniques that allowed them to fight often, fight without injury, fight without losing knockouts, to defend against almost any kind of style. A lot of them were great, great punchers. To understand the mechanics of boxing in a particularly sophisticated way. And these were fighters, I mean, they were above all kind of defensive specialists, which does not mean that they were necessarily all defensive fighters. A lot of them could knock out anyone. But the idea behind Black Code is that you can fight frequently without injury, and you fight in a way that keeps you healthy.
So perhaps the sort of foremost practitioners of Black Code would be someone like Charlie Burley, right?
I think Charlie Burley is a great example. Now, I mean, Charlie Burley, of course, could knock out anyone. But yes, Charlie Burley is a wonderful example of Black Code. He was virtually impossible to hit. I don't think he was on the canvas more than 2 or 3 times in his whole career, and he was never knocked out. And he often fought guys who were 30 and 40 pounds heavier than he was. And he fought, what they call the Black Murderer's Row. And he was considered, of that particular group of fighters, the best of the bunch. I personally think that Ezra Charles was the best of the bunch, but and maybe Ezra Charles was excluded by matters of geography. But
because the Murderers Row were mainly based on the West Coast, I believe, right?
Correct. Right. That's right. Yeah, it was the Hogue brothers, Jack Chase, Billy Smith, Eddie Booker, who was a great fighter. Right, Archie Moore, for that matter.
And in terms of the way the code and that style of fighting and that style of kind of managing your career has declined, are there any fighters you see, either in this generation or in the sort of most recent generation, who you could trace that tradition to?
Not many, but yes, I do. I do think there are some. Now, in this particular instance, I want to be clear that I'm talking about black fighters, and which is not to say that fighters, of Hispanic fighters, white fighters, Asian fighters don't do a lot of the same things or can't do all of these things. But I'm talking about a tradition that comes through the gyms and comes through culture. So, Black Code, I think, applies to black fighters. Again, it has nothing to do with any kind of inherent ability or even any kind of training regimen. It has to do with culture, what you learn from growing up, what you learn from the gyms. But you mentioned in your email to me Hopkins, Mayweather, and James Toney, and I think those guys all qualify. I think that they're definitely Black Code fighters. And as you know, I mentioned I managed a guy named Freddie Norwood, who was a quintessential Black Code fighter. I mean,
I was going to ask you about Norwood because obviously he's kind of verging onto the modern era. Certainly, he was still a name when I first got into the sport, but was very much past his best. But yeah, could you managing him and kind of, you must have seen that tradition up close.
I did. As a matter of fact, let me just mention 2 more fighters, contemporary fighters, who I think are good exemplars of Black Code. I think that Terence Crawford and Andre Ward both fit into the mold very, very well.
Oh, really? Well, but surely Andre Ward is the opposite. He never fights.
Well, he doesn't. No, but I mean, right. Well, none of these guys. I mean, look, in terms of frequency of fighting, no one applies. I mean, you know, again, the culture is different, the economy is different, the audience is different. So, in terms of fighting frequently, that doesn't exist anymore, and will never exist again. So, in terms of that element of the definition, that has to be excluded.
But those are the type of guys who, in another time, could have fought frequently. You're saying?
I believe so. Yeah, I do. I think that they understood what you need to do to protect yourself. You know, to keep from getting hit hard. I mean, you know, they have the requisite skills, I would say.
I think there was a stat in the article you wrote, which was if you took the fighters, the Eddie Booker, Burley, Ezra Charles, etc., and you added them on to, I think it was Tony Hopkins and Mayweather, and the total across something like 8 fighters was over 1,000 fights, and only something like 9 KOs, losses.
Right, and I think I pointed out that in the years that most of them fought, a fight that was stopped on a cut from a headbutt was a TKO loss. You know, so even I wouldn't be surprised if half of those knockout losses today, for example, would go to the scorecards. But in terms of Norwood came out of a deep tradition of black code. Norwood was trained by a very good junior welterweight named Adolph Pruitt, who in fact had been managed by Henry Armstrong. And of course, it goes without saying, you guys all know who Henry Armstrong is, and you probably also know who Adolph Pruitt is. So this is like the deepest kind of black code education you can get. So Norwood, in his prime, which is when he was 122 pounds, was virtually impossible to hit with anything. And when you tried to hit him, you would pay horribly for your mistake, because one of the other elements of black code fighting is punch placement, is to keep your hands moving and to understand trajectory of punches. So a guy like Norwood, you try and hit him and his defense would be perfect, and you'd miss. And he was a southpaw, so you know you'd be hit with with a right jab followed by a hook, and then a left uppercut, and these things, they'd be head, body, liver, and then he'd be back in defense. And it was just a beautiful, beautiful thing to see. By the time he became a fighter who the public knew, which I guess would probably be for the Marquez fight, that fighter was a shell of the fighter I knew.
So do you think
Charles, can I just ask you about a current 122 pounder, and that's Guillermo Rigondeaux, and get your thoughts on him, if that's okay?
Of course. Thank you for asking about him. I think that Rigondeaux is the best fighter in the world, and the best fighter I've seen in many, many years. I think he's, he fights at a level of sophistication that is almost entirely beyond the understanding, not only of casual viewers, but of most serious viewers. He's a brilliant fighter.
So, with the way Rigondeaux fights, obviously we can see there's a lot of backlash against it, led by Mr. Raphael, for one.
Yes.
About him, the better. But obviously I noted the article you did for Deadspin.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of interesting things in there. Obviously, I'm a big fan of Rigondeaux, so I'm always trying to sing his praises. So, what did you think about the Donaire fight? What was your thoughts before, during, and after that?
Before, I was a little concerned about the difference in size. Yeah. I think that realistically, no matter what weight Rigondeaux fights at, he's a glorified bantamweight.
Yeah.
He may win a title at 22 and at 26, and he may even move up and fight at 30. It's possible, I suppose. But he's a 118-pounder, and he's old. I mean, I don't know how old, but my guess is he's 40. again, no matter what the record book says. So I was a little concerned about that because I've got a lot of respect for Donaire. You know, I think he's a tough guy, and I certainly think he punches awfully hard. But I thought that fight, that performance, was the best performance that anyone had given in a decade.
Yeah,
it's a real work of art.
It was. They tried to sort of wash that away and saying how negative he wasn't. But Donaire had literally, was it not the week before Donaire had gone to pick his Fighter of the Year award up? And
it was. Yep.
Literally the week before, because I can remember all the footage, the HBO Road 2 footage, and he just absolutely took it to pieces. The only punch Donaire landed was the one that put him down. And again, that's his signature punch, and he still got up and then beat him for the rest of the fight.
On this
well, you know what I thought was interesting? Tell me if you felt the same way about this. When Rigondeaux got knocked down, he became aggressive. And he not only won the rest of the round, he in effect made Donaire say, okay, that's it. I'm not going to try that again.
Yeah. Because it was after that, he was pouring at the eyes, keeping, I think his right hand was up a lot more, and he was more conscious of what was coming back at him then. Because I think it was sort of like he realised he had to go and do something. He did something, and then it sort of backfired a little bit on him.
That's the way I read it too. Yeah, that's what I thought happened. I agree, and I've seen that with Rigondeaux's fights over and over again, where a guy like Obeko, who's a tough guy, realizes maybe a minute and a half into the first round, I don't have a chance against this guy, so I'm going to hope he lets me live, and I'm not going to push him too hard. I'm not going to bother him much, and maybe I'll be okay. And, I think what people don't understand about Rigondeaux is that he has such control of what he's doing that he doesn't feel the need to close the show. If somebody's not bothering him, he won't necessarily bother them. But if they become aggressive, he makes sure that they understand that that's a big, big mistake.
On that topic, almost playing devil's advocate here, because we're obviously talking about Rigondeaux as fans of just what he does in the ring, but as a former boxing manager yourself, how would you have felt managing someone like Rigondeaux and trying to sell that sort of style? I mean, obviously, this style isn't appealing to a mass audience and isn't conducive to making a lot of money. How would you have gone about that? Would you have dreaded having to deal with that sort of difficulty in selling him?
Well, I mean, I think I had a similar task in selling Norwood. I think that Norwood was also a really consummate fighter who fought in a style that people didn't necessarily like, and he was an incredibly hard sell. And I think the way that you have to do it, first of all, you have to, when he beats a guy who's the Fighter of the Year, you have to make a lot of noise about the fact that he just easily handled the Fighter of the Year. Now what does that make him? If this is the best guy in the world, and my guy, the guy I'm representing, wins 11 and a half rounds out of 12, he's the best fighter in the world. And if you don't think so, it means that you need to study what you're watching. And I think that's the way you start doing it. Is what you do is you work with the people who do the commentary on TV, so that the narrative, which they fuck up terribly over and over again, changes. Where they say, look, this guy, the reason you're seeing him, why he's being economical is he doesn't need to throw punches. The reason, that he's doing what he's doing with his right jab, that's a ghost punch. What that's doing is it's making the other guy look at shadows and follow something that's not there, and he's becoming dizzy and he's becoming disoriented. And a punch is going to follow that. Nobody knows where that punch is coming from or what it's going to be, but it's going to knock this guy down. That's much more sophisticated than anything you're used to watching. And
is that something you did then? Were you in contact with like commentary teams and people like that to try and say, well, my guy fights like this, can you try and big my guy up? Is that something that you were involved in, or is it like a network decision?
I think it's a network decision, but I think what you have to do is, and you can do this better now than when I was coming up, make it clear in every social media what you've got. And a lot of people will disagree with you, but there will be people who see it. And you could say, not only is this guy one of the top 10 fighters in the world, he's the best fighter in the world, and he's much better than whoever's number 2. I mean, for example, I would say right now the number 2 fighter in the world, and I think the world of him, is Roman Gonzalez.
Yeah.
Great fighter, and a guy who's a traditional fan-friendly fighter, right?
No, dude, you gotta love the knockouts he gets. That's the one thing that people can't knock him for, that they tend to knock Rigondeaux for. He is aggressive and will go for it.
He is. But, and I got nothing but praise for the guy. I think he's a fantastic fighter. But he's operating, again, at a different level of sophistication.
Yeah.
He's a beatable fighter. I mean, I don't know who's going to do it, and I don't see anybody doing it right now. But I mean, if we're going to talk about the guys who are the consensus best fighters in the world, and I'll leave that to you guys to come up with, who would you say are the best 5 fighters in the world right now?
Well, Rigondeaux, Gonzalez,
yeah,
Ward.
Yeah, you still have to say Ward, I think.
I
would say still Pacquiao, even though he's a shadow of his former self. I'd say he's still around the conversation for top 5.
Yeah, I have a feeling Bradley might beat him though, so I'm not going to go with that one.
And then possibly someone like Kovalev, Charles, just in terms of how dominant he is at the moment.
Okay, I think those are great examples. Now, for the sake of argument, let's somehow transpose Rigondeaux to their size and put Rigondeaux in against Manny Pacquiao. What happened? Again, forget about the fact that Rigondeaux traditionally fights guys who are much bigger than he is. Let's assume they're actually the same size.
I think he'd knock Pacquiao out.
Oh yeah,
with a counterpunch.
Exactly.
I think if you look at Pacquiao when he was at the lower weights, if you get Pacquiao at 122, 126, you look at that version of him, he knocks him out.
He knocks him out, absolutely, because it's a style that's perfect for Rigondeaux. All right, now let's go with Kovalev. Great, smart fighter. He is susceptible to sneak punches. He does not have a great chin.
Yeah.
He's way too crude to fight a guy. I mean, I like him. I think he's a good fighter. But if you sort of transpose these guys to being the same size.
Yeah.
With no advantage, going to either guy, I think you see that Rigondeaux really. You try to figure out how. I mean, there are these things that are perceived as liabilities, and he gets knocked down.
But yeah, he gets. So this is the thing. It's always chin's dodgy. It's not, because he got up every time. So Amagasa, he was like 140 pounds when they fought, when they were in the ring. It was massive.
Exactly.
Bunch of a guy. Probably
he got knocked down by Donaire, but it was at a time when Donaire was putting guys,
to sleep.
Yamagasi's about 5'10" as well, and obviously the weight, so that had a big factor in that fight as well. The sheer size.
And the mess that Rigondeaux made of him, he destroyed him. His face was an absolute mess.
I was so shocked that they didn't pull that poor kid out of the fight rounds early. I really was. I was worried. I was thinking. I mean, I don't want to be melodramatic here, but I was thinking of Dooku Kim, or Johnny Owen. How much do you want this guy to take?
But my impression of that was, I thought they weren't pulling him out because they were going to rob Rigondeaux if it got to the final bell. That was my impression at the time.
The scorecards, it turns out, didn't reflect that, though.
No, it was, but that was. I just had the feeling when I was watching it, thinking he's putting down.
I think it was just the corner getting a bit brave and maybe thinking that, oh well, put him down once, so maybe he's got that one. He's got that one. And do it again. Charles, can I just ask? Sorry, going back slightly.
Sure.
Of the hypothetical top 5 that we named, how would you see Ward against Rigondeaux going if they're the same size?
Horrible fight. You know, I mean, I love them both. I think they're great fighters, and I got a lot of admiration for what a tough, dirty fighter. You know, I love the fact that the way Ward presents himself in public, and what a nasty guy he is in the ring. But I think what would happen is Rigondeaux doesn't need any space to land his punches. He doesn't need anything. Those punches come from nowhere, and they're in and they're out and they're fast. And he's also got better footwork than, you know, maybe anybody else in the world. He's got just beautiful footwork. And so I think what he'd be able to do with Ward, if they were the same size, is land very quick punches and keep moving. And I think Ward would wind up a step behind all night. I'm sure it would go the distance, and I'm sure people wouldn't enjoy it very much. But I think that Rigondeaux would win a decision.
Charles.
Sorry, go on, Andy.
Can I just ask you, what's your opinion on Gennady Golovkin? How do you rate him, and what's your thoughts on him?
I like him. I like him a lot. I think he's a very tough guy. I think, you know, his power is overrated, but he's got very good power. He's a good boxer. He's got a lot of spirit.
Well, he's another one I think that a lot of people single out his footwork as being excellent, like you were praising Rigondeaux.
No, I think it is. I mean, as a matter of fact, I think he's a very sound guy at all aspects of the game. I think he's a fine fighter. I mean, really one of the better fighters in the world, one of the best fighters in the world. I think the thing that as a matter of fact, it's funny. I would say, you know, for me, he's a better fighter than Kovalev. I know there are people who disagree with that, but I think that he is more well-rounded, and I think he's probably I know he's got a better chin.
He famously put Kovalev down in sparring, of course. Yeah. Is the story from a few years ago that Golovkin put Kovalev down with a body shot when they had a spar at whatever weight it was, and that was I remember Kellerman saying that during one of his early appearances on HBO. Can I just ask Charles, sorry, to play devil's advocate slightly?
Sure.
Rigondeaux's most recent fight, and I've completely forgotten the name of the opponent, but that was a guy who came forward, was very crude, but Rigondeaux just seemed completely disinterested in fighting. I don't know if you had any idea why that might have been.
I saw the fight, and you know what it seemed to me, it was a terrible fight. I mean, it was boring, and I think that Rigondeaux did not look good. You know, for him, I thought he didn't look good at all. You know, I thought that, you know, he's not a young guy, and I thought that the layoff made him flat. You know, he looked ring rusty to me. You're talking about what's the guy's name? Francisco, Adrian Francisco. I also thought he looked puffy to me. You know, so I get the impression that he came in slightly out of shape. You know, he was so economical it didn't matter. But that
he
was not.
He took the fight on very short notice, of course, didn't he? It was just a few days' notice, I believe.
A few days' notice, and I think it showed. I mean, I think, you know, he's 40-ish, and he's been inactive, and he took the fight on short notice, and I think all those things were factors, and it was a substandard performance, and I think it did him a lot of harm.
Can I ask one final one on Rigondeaux, because I know as much as we love talking about him, there's a lot of listeners who think he's as boring as they come and don't want him anywhere near their TV shows again, TV screens again. But the Rigondeaux-Lomachenko fight has been talked about for a long time. Would you like to see that, especially at 126? Because I've always thought that it's very unreasonable for Lomachenko to expect Rigondeaux to go all the way up when, like you said, he's really a 118-pounder.
You know, I've got mixed feelings about that fight. Because I mean, the thing that I know is going to happen, I can feel it. You know, I'm almost certain of it. Rigondeaux is going to lose sometime soon, and he's going to lose to a fighter who's his inferior. And the reason he's going to lose is because too much is being asked of him in terms of his body. You know, in light of his age and in light of his size. I mean, he really is a small guy. And so there's only so far he can move up. And that's going to wind up being his undoing. You know, if he could fight at 118 pounds, he'd be the world champion, and, you know, until he died of old age. Nobody would ever touch him. I'm not entirely sold on Lomachenko yet. I think that there are things that I like about him a lot, but I don't think he's as good a fighter as he's being made out to be. He's not a puncher.
He still has habits from the amateur days, doesn't he? I think it's quite clear to see that he hasn't fully transitioned yet.
And he's not going to. At least I don't think he's going to. I mean, that's not a, you know, I'm not being dismissive of him. He's a very, very good fighter, but I think he spent such a long time in the amateurs that I think what we're seeing is fairly close to the way he's going to wind up. And you know, I think that Rigondeaux would probably be able to outbox him pretty consistent. I mean, there's another guy who's got beautiful footwork. I mean, Lomachenko's got great footwork, but it's not, you know, it's largely to no purpose. A lot of what he does as a fighter is just busy work. You know, it's marking time, it's doing a lot, but it doesn't have a strategy behind it. So I think that Rigondeaux would outbox him pretty easily. What I would be worried about, and I would like to see it, but what I'd be worried about is whether the difference in their size would be too much to overcome. I mean, you know, the guy who, at this point it looks like it's off the table, but I was very nervous at one point that they'd try and put Rigondeaux in with Nicholas Walters. And that made me very uncomfortable.
Yeah, well, it's funny you mentioned Walters, because he's a guy who I've always been very skeptical of, because I felt he was fighting much smaller opponents. And he was getting credit for beating guys like Darchinian and Donaire, who were guys who were old, coming up from 1 or 2 weight divisions below, and getting beaten by a guy who comes into the ring at 145 pounds.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's true, you know. But I mean, that's, you know, in a way, that's like saying one of the reasons why Sandy Sadler was one of the greatest, you know, featherweights who ever lived was because he was, you know, 5'10", had an enormous reach, and really should have weighed 165 pounds. Well, you know, he made 126. And I guess if you can do it, you're entitled to it.
I think the issue now is that perhaps Walters can't do it anymore, but instead of going up to 130 properly, he wants catch weights with smaller men, which I really just don't like at all. I think it's, like you said, I think it's very, very dangerous for a guy Rigo's size. Sorry, yep. You wanted to ask something.
Yeah, so I've just got something. So it's pretty well documented about the handlers he's got, so Caribe or whatever they're going by now. So obviously they've helped bring him over from Cuba. So in essence, is this belief probably on their part that they sort of own him. So the worry I have from time to time, and it has been expressed by stuff I've seen Gary Hyde say, is that some of these characters are a little bit, well, they're not the most trustworthy of people. So do you think there's any way we're going to see a correlation between Rigo and fixed fights because of these handlers who seem to think that they owe him and they own him, should I say?
It's a good question. You know, my guess is that's a very good question. I would instinctively I would tend to say no, largely because this is not a good answer. So I apologize for it, but let me try. I think there's a kind of dignity, a kind of artistry to the way Rigondeaux fights.
Yeah.
That, to me, links up with his character.
Yeah.
And I just sense that he's a guy whose personal pride would, and let me further say, I don't think there's anything disreputable about throwing a fight. That's not what I'm trying to say. But my guess is he's not that kind of guy, and I think he would be offended at the idea. I think he also has a great notion of who he is. I think he recognizes what a great fighter he is, and it means a lot to him. And I think it would offend him to lose to an inferior. I could be completely wrong about all that.
Yeah, well, because I've considered this myself. It's just after the bits I've read, particularly something about, I forgot what the opponent was when he fought in Mexico, and there was a lot of shady goings on around that. But I was always of the belief that while ever he's unbeaten and while ever he's making money, that's not the route they're going to go down. But if things were to turn south, to say he does get beat and maybe gets beat a few times, then that's when I would hope it wouldn't happen, but that's when we might see that sort of thing come around.
Well, I think if he gets beat, and he gets beat a few times, first of all, there won't be any big money fights for him, no matter what. And more than that, I think we're talking about a boxing world who would love to be rid of him. So, I think if he loses, especially more than once,
yeah,
there's a big headache that gets out of everyone's way. That's a problem that goes away. And I think I think Bob Arum, was apoplectic when he beat Tonnerre. He thought, geez, this is the last guy I want to have to do anything for. And so, no, I think if he, especially with his age, if he loses, he more or less disappears. There was a guy a couple of years ago, I know you all know who he is, Joan Guzman.
Yeah.
Who I think was, for a while, the best fighter in the world. But nobody wanted him. And Don King, for a while, kind of used him as a chess piece. But he was this very dangerous guy. Another guy who kept moving up in weight until finally, he moved up too far. The boxing world wants to get rid of guys like that. And I think Rigondeaux is really at the top of the list of people who the boxing world wants to get rid of.
I think with that, I mentioned him earlier, but it's a pretty unprofessional thing from his end, but like idiots like Dan Raphael, they wouldn't ever get bored of seeing him lose, so he'd probably be wanting to see more of him. And I think that he's quite a bit of a problem when it comes to people like Rigondeaux.
Can we talk about Dan Raphael for a minute?
If it's in a negative light, you can do as long as you want.
Good. I'll make it really fairly brief. But there are a couple of guys who ordinarily I don't talk about this sort of thing. But there are a couple of guys whose word, for whatever reason, is influential in the business, and they're people who don't know anything at all about boxing, and more than that, they have some of them have personal agendas, and the funny thing is the agenda part of it doesn't offend me. That's business. That's business. If a guy like Dan Raphael is making money on his own somehow, more power to him. But this is a guy who knows absolutely nothing about boxing, nothing. And yet he's influential. Yeah. And I've actually talked to people with whom I'm friendly who say, well, I don't want to say this because it would get Dan Raphael upset, or I disagree with him. And I think, well, why? He's a guy, he's an idiot with a microphone. And, he can't write, and he doesn't know anything about boxing. I've never met the guy. This isn't personal.
His scorecards aren't great either.
He doesn't know anything. He's just some guy off the street. And there's a kind of arrogance to him that drives me crazy. I think he's an imbecile. And since we can say this on your show, I think he's a fucking imbecile. I hope. Let me say that about Teddy Atlas too. Another fucking imbecile. Okay, I'm done with the rant.
We've said worse. Don't worry.
Okay.
Charles, I just wanted to ask a sort of more general question, because I appreciate that we've had you for nearly 2 hours now, and we really appreciate you giving us so much time.
Oh, thank you.
It's really just you could sort of take it however you want, but I was just wondering if, as a former manager and as a former sort of a guy who would have kept an eye out for boxing talent and guys who you think could have gone a fair distance in the sport, is there anyone on the current scene that either you would love to manage because you think they're just gold dust, or unbelievably talented, or anyone that you feel has been poorly guided that you think I could have done something for them? Is there anyone like that around now or recently?
Sure, there are a number of people. I mean, Rigondeaux comes to mind, of course, first. I think Gamboa is a guy. Gamboa is a guy who should have made money. Should have been a much bigger name than he became. He ate himself out of the kind of consideration he might have had. I think he has incredible talent. The guy who didn't do anything, again, another Don King chess piece, who I would have loved to have tried to do something with, is Guillermo Jones, who is a stone killer. Who's just always been kind of caught in nowhere land, no man's land, where people don't even know who he is largely.
Well, he's a guy who pops up every few months, and every time you think to yourself, oh, is that Guillermo Jones? He's still fighting. Oh, and
right.
As soon as he's off the TV, you forget about him. Yeah.
And yet he beats guys he's not supposed to beat. He knocks everybody out. I mean, he's just a great natural fighter and a murderous puncher. And I always thought, well, if I had free reign with somebody like Guillermo Jones, I'd keep him. I'd make sure that he knocked out the people who other people were building up, because I think he could at cruiser, and he could still make cruiser. There's nobody who can beat him, especially if he stayed active.
You hear that? Guillermo Jones beats Usyk. That's Alexander Usyk, the Ukrainian guy, is Paul's favourite.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna have to disagree with that. It worked that flabby body.
Yeah, but that flabby body. I'll tell you something about that. He's one of those guys. You're talking about Jones having a flabby body.
Yeah.
He's actually got a great fighter's body. He's got completely relaxed muscle. He's got long arms. He's got I know aesthetically he doesn't look like a fighter, but he doesn't get hurt. He doesn't get cut. He's able to throw punches from his shoulder with no effort whatsoever. I think that's one of those cases where looks are really deceiving. I think that his body suits him really well. And of course, he's come up from, I think, 141 or so. Yeah. I think junior welterweight when he started. I don't know if you guys recently saw Felix Diaz, the guy who lost to Lamont Peterson.
Yeah, that was a little
bit controversial. That one. Yeah.
There's a guy I think would be interesting to try and do something with.
I think with him, that loss is probably a good thing, as strange as it sounds, because he's sort of come out of it with a bit of credit, and it sometimes gets you into fights a bit easier, doesn't it?
I think a controversial loss will usually guarantee you another TV date.
Yeah.
Well, but here's the thing. Here's what worries me about Diaz. People who are watching him, who are matching up their fighters, saw, well, he just beat Peterson, regardless of what the decision was, and he's really talented and he's really confident, and beating him doesn't mean a whole lot. Do we want to put our kid in with this guy? And I think it remains to be seen, but I'm a little bit worried that people are going to avoid him.
I think, the risk reward is not in his favour at the moment, is it?
Exactly. No. And, one last guy, I mean, at this point, it would be great to manage Luis Ortiz because, just challenge everybody. Just, you don't think twice. It doesn't matter who you put him in with.
I don't think. Again, this is based on the one performance against Jennings, which I was incredibly impressed with, because I do think Jennings is a legitimately high-level. I mean, it seems harsh to call him a gatekeeper, but he's a high-level kind of contender that you need to get past in a division where the champions are really not that much better than him. The way Ortiz just walked straight through him was very impressive.
The thing that impresses me about Luis Ortiz is, for his size, his speed, and his punch variation, it's for a man his size to fight the kind of style he does. It's good. It's refreshing in this day and age when a lot of heavyweights will just kind of stick behind the jab and work at long range, and he likes to get in and go to the body and mix things up. I think he's a very, very exciting fighter. Obviously, he's old. I think he's 36 years old. That may be his only drawback, but he's definitely getting in the mix.
I think it's the relaxation thing Charles spoke about earlier, isn't it? He just looks so relaxed when he throws his punches. And Charles, I'm sure you're aware of Anthony Joshua, but he's obviously the big prospect in the UK at the moment in terms of a guy who could potentially, win world titles in the future. And he's already a household name, almost, I'd say, verging on. And but is a comparative novice and is kind of learning on the job. But we've been constantly kind of worried about him because he's so mechanical and stiff, and he's so muscle bound that he seems to have real problems sort of improvising and throwing those relaxed shots that you were talking about, whereas Ortiz is just like, he's really like water in there in terms of the way he can just sort of slide up to opponents and get these shots off.
Right, and he's also a very, very physically strong guy. He moves like Greg Page, but he can really punch. Now, I think in the UK, Joshua is a challenge. I can see where he's got a great, great future ahead of him, but there's so much to watch out for.
He could very well be another Frank Bruno, couldn't he? I think.
I think that's possible. I mean, again, he doesn't have the kind of obstacles in front of him that Frank Bruno would have had in terms of really, really tough guys. But what do you do with him now? I mean, the White win was a good win. It was instructive in some ways, but for example, in the U.S. he doesn't have a big name now, so if he fights here, he's sort of got to fight a world champion to make it worth his while. What do you do with him? I mean, if somehow he were offered a fight with Wilder, I'd say go ahead and take it. But obviously he can't fight Ortiz, right? I mean, he'd get destroyed.
And I think his promoter has done a lot of backpedaling in about the last week to do with the David Haye fight, which obviously you'd think was a no-brainer in the UK because that would sell a stadium out next week. But they've said that that's not a consideration for the near future. So that's another one where I think potentially he could get wiped out because
it's funny. I think that's a mistake because unless they're fixing his fights, it doesn't look to me as if they're fixing Joshua's fights. Well, at least not all of them, and maybe not the most recent ones. There isn't a big money fight out there for him, and you can't really see a huge money fight for him in the future until maybe if somehow Fury gets by Klitschko a second time, that's a good fight for him. But David Haye is a huge fight for him, and what I worry about is that he gets cashed out in a fight that means much less for a lot less money. And then you don't have the option of restructuring to put him in that big money fight. So, I mean, I think, even though that's incredibly dangerous, I don't think he'd win. I don't think he could beat David Haye. Although, it's hard to know what David Haye is like right now, despite his last fight. I assume that's worth $10 million. I don't U.S. dollars in Britain. Am I right about that?
I'd say at least that much. Just for sort of reference, the fight against Dillian Whyte was a pay-per-view fight, which we protested vehemently, seeing as it was a British title level fight, and we said, anyone who pays for this on pay-per-view is really asking for trouble, because Joshua will be on pay-per-view for the rest of the next decade now. And that, according to the stories, that did 400,000 sales, and that's in the UK, and that's an unbelievably high number for, again, no world title on the line. Mm-hmm. So I think the Hay fight would make probably double. I'd say $20 million.
Well, if I were managing Joshua, I'd take that fight. I'd roll the dice and let that be his payday, rather than risking a much, much less substantial payday against a fighter. I mean, I just don't see another fight for him in the next 2 or 3 years that begins to bring him that kind of money. And he still has to fight other people. And
he's shown vulnerability, hasn't he, at times?
I think so. Yes, I think so. Even against White, there were moments that I really didn't like what I was seeing. I think he's, you don't want another Audley Harrison, right?
Well, yeah, poor Audley. You should have managed him. He was, kind of chewed up and spat out a little bit. But it's funny to think of how high the hopes were for Harrison, 10, 12 years ago.
I remember being in London and seeing billboards that just said Audley. He was
so funny to
of a name.
Imagine that now. It's almost absurd.
He's practically a joke now. You say the name Audley Harrison, it's almost just like a bit of a farce over here now, which is a bit of a shame, really, like you say, considering how much he was hyped. But that's how much opinion can sway, I guess.
And that's the potential downfall that Joshua could have, unless everything is orchestrated absolutely perfectly for him. So again, I would say that if the Hay fight can be made, go ahead and make it. And and look, it's not as if Hay's got the best chin in the world by any means. So there's a chance that fight could go the other way. I mean, if I were betting, I'd bet Hay, but
for sure. I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. It's mainly to do with just the speed of Hay compared to everyone else Joshua's fought. We've been quite critical of his level of competition coming up. Especially considering how easily he's been winning, and yet the competition hasn't really got any better. And you just think our main concern has been for over sort of a year and a half now, has been that he's not learning anything.
Well, I mean, that I assume means that the people who are moving him are very, very worried about him, or unless he's hit his ceiling. I mean, you would probably know that a lot better than I did. Is this as far as he can go? I mean, Wilder isn't going to get any better. Wilder is, what you're seeing is what he's going to wind up being.
Well, Wilder's been, I think, depending on which way you look at it, either unbelievably fortunate or superbly manoeuvred to get to where he is. Having had the title for a year, potentially going to have a unification fight, potentially going to end up with half the belts in the heavyweight division. It's absolutely absurd that he can use the back door to get this far. It's just crazy.
Well, except that I mean, you're right. I agree with you completely. The thing is, he hasn't made any money, and right now, it's interesting to me. There's less of a buzz about Wilder now than there was a year ago. So he's kind of reached a point of diminishing returns, and now something has to be done with him, and there were fewer options than there were before he was the champ. I mean, so
the news today is about the Povetkin fight, and they have 30 days to negotiate and all this stuff. But I'm sure someone will apply for extension and etc. and it will rumble on. But potentially, one of the stumbling blocks has been that they don't want to go to Russia. But Povetkin's promoter is the richest man in the sport, and if he wins a purse bid, Deontay Wilder will get a hell of a lot of money. So you think, I don't know if that might be tempting for him. I don't know if Heyman would be so keen, but because let's be honest, they're not going to be doing drug testing in Russia, and then it's not going to be a level playing field. But if he wants to cash himself out, that would make a lot more money than any fight in America, I think.
Well, I mean, he gets beaten up, but I don't know that that's a bad fight for him. The only thing is, I think that I've got very mixed feelings about Heyman. But one of the things I will say about him is, although he moves fighters very well and very quickly, he doesn't have a talent for developing stars. And he's got the same problem with Wilder that he has with Thurman. They're not stars, and those are kind of his flagship fighters. And someone working for him, he's got to hire somebody who has a better sense of who people will become interested in.
I do think Bob Arum obviously gets a lot of criticism, and much of it rightly so, but he has clearly shown that he can take guys like Crawford, who, for all intents and purposes, is a guy from sort of the back end of America, the middle of nowhere, right, who does not have an engaging personality, but he has become a very popular fighter. Not saying he's pay-per-view yet, of course, but he's close, I think. Maybe with the right victory, he could become a pay-per-view fighter. And you look at guys like Thurman and Danny Garcia, who could in terms of their styles, they're maybe more exciting, but they've just plateaued and they don't seem to be going anywhere.
No, that's exactly. Well, I mean, I think Crawford's an interesting case. I think Crawford's a case where the narrative that he needed to move him, into serious consideration has been put in place. He's got this subtle style, but he looks great in winning. He beats tough guys, and this is a case where the broadcasters are doing their work, and that's important. And I give Arum, I've got a lot of problems with Arum, but I give Arum credit for that. I think that he's instrumental in making sure that gets done.
And I mean, we've been a bit critical of his opponents, especially I don't think Hank Lundy is a good enough opponent for a main event HBO. A guy who's it's not his first fight at the weight. He's been there for a while. I don't see Lundy as any better than the guys he'd been fighting previously, and I'd really like to see the Postol fight. I think that's an excellent win for either guy, and something that we'd learn a lot in that fight. But you've got the carrot on the end of the stick that is Pacquiao, and I think he's got enough goodwill, Crawford, for at least this year.
Yes, I know. I think that's right. And Pacquiao. Obviously, I think all boxing people, that was the fight that everyone wanted. Is Pacquiao Crawford. But I mean, it was obvious that wasn't going to happen. There's no way in the world. Freddie Roach is far too savvy to put a fight like that together.
I try to sort of be, and I understand completely what you mean, and I can remember thinking I'd be very surprised if they'd have to, offer a lot of money for Freddie Roach to take it as Pacquiao's potentially last fight, because if he beats Crawford, that's fantastic, but that really, really hurts Top Rank, and then they're suddenly left with a guy on a loss and a guy who's just retired, and that's the kind of fight where you think it's going to be stacked against Pacquiao, whatever happens, not just stylistically, but in terms of the extra factors as well, because Bob Arum will do everything he can to prevent being left with nothing, essentially, by Pacquiao saying not put out. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I also think that Arum, who's not a boxing guy, has got very, very good boxing people behind him, always has, and I think that any serious boxing person will say that's a risk you can take, because Crawford is, at this stage, is much too much for Pacquiao. It's a horrible matchup for Pacquiao, and if Crawford wins by knockout, which I expect he would, you've got yourself a superstar here. You've got the hottest prospect in the business with a lot of fights to come. I mean, fights. Really intriguing matchups. When we're talking about risk reward, I think that's probably worth it.
Yeah, I agree. Like you say, I just think you'd really need to make it worth Freddie Roach's while to and in a kind of a sort of romantic way, I'd be a bit sad if Pacquiao had his final fight and lost by KO. I think that would be. I think he deserves a bit better than that, and I wouldn't begrudge him saying, "Do you know what? I don't want to go out that way. I want to end on a win." And I think, if he retires after Bradley 3, I wouldn't be angry. I wouldn't be resentful of him in any way. Charles, sorry, I'm very conscious of the time, but we just thought,
of course,
if no one else has got any other questions, I thought I'd finish by a sort of quick-fire series of questions, just because, and again, feel free not to answer any of these if you don't wish to. But it was, based on what we were saying right at the beginning of the pod, that, about certain fights being fixed in various different ways, and I thought I'd just give you a few matchups from the last few years which have raised some eyebrows from us, and just thinking, whether you thought these were fixed in any way, and you can literally just say yes or no, or
sure.
Or pass.
Sure.
First one, going back to Deontay Wilder, Wilder versus Stiverne.
Yes, fixed.
Yeah, I agree completely. Everyone else? Oh, they're listening enraptured. Next one.
Or they've fallen asleep.
Yeah.
Just no comment. I mean,
Sorry, Alex, go on.
I'd rather hear Charles's opinion.
Yeah, fair enough. If you want to elaborate as to why, feel free. But
to me, pretty simple. Stiverne is an older guy. He's not making money. Wasn't going to make any money. King is basically out of the business. It's interesting to me that that Wilder's next fight was against a nondescript Don King fighter, which leads me to believe.
It. Yes, absolutely.
Right. So it leads me to believe that what happened is King traded with Heyman to give co-promotional rights to at least one defense by Wilder, and maybe another one down the line. Stiverne put money in his pocket. I think what happened is he refused to allow Wilder to knock him out. I think he just put his foot down on that point and said, "I'm not going to let him knock me out."
Yeah, he basically sleptwalked through 12 rounds, didn't he? Essentially.
That's not the guy I've ever seen before, and I know that. Who was it? Was it Ronnie Shields? Who was? I'm trying to remember. Was in his corner. Said, I thought. He said, by the second round, I thought the fight was bought.
Oh, really? I hadn't heard that. Okay, that's from the horse's mouth, isn't it?
Yes.
The next one, which I think is possibly the most egregious example in recent years, is the rematch of Jonathan Banks versus Seth Mitchell.
Sure, absolutely, right. The first one was a mistake, and they corrected it.
Yeah, and to me, that was Banks was. He could have been sleepwalking again. Just absolutely no effort to win at all. But again, perhaps he refused to be knocked out.
Right. I'm maybe, although it's not as if he hasn't been knocked out before. But right, no, I think what happened is Mitchell was being curried as a potential, opponent in the next year or so, maybe 2 years, for Klitschko, and then he got derailed by Banks, and they were just rectifying an error.
Another one, slightly sort of, I guess, more subtle form of fixing would be Canelo versus Cotto, just because of the scorecards, which just seemed, there was no way Cotto was going to knock Canelo out, but then it just seemed like he never had a chance on the cards, basically.
No, to me that seemed legitimate as far as I could tell. Yeah, I think it was legitimate.
Maybe just slightly wide cards then, but yeah, nothing untoward. Another one again, it's Canelo again. Canelo versus Lara, where you had the I think it was a 118, 110 card for Canelo, or a couple that were that seemed to have been filled out beforehand.
Well, again, that's what we were talking about earlier. A completely real fight where you make sure that you've got at least one judge beforehand, and that the one judge is almost always the wide judge, and and that's already taken care of, and then someone else on close rounds makes sure that your guy is the one who wins, and you wind up with a much closer scorecard, and as long as you've done that, you've got the fight. So real fight, purchased judging.
Yeah. I think actually you might be horrified to learn you found yourself agreeing with Teddy Atlas, because I think in the immediate aftermath of that fight he said he pointed to the wide card and said, "That's Golden Boy's insurance policy for Canelo," essentially.
You know, what do they say about a clock? You know, twice a yeah, right. Good for him.
Yeah, we'll have to get you back on when Teddy's in full promotion mode for Pacquiao Bradley, and you can really let rip on him. But just before we finish off, if anyone else has got any other examples of fixed fights that I haven't mentioned. AZ?
I don't know, I've missed most of that because I've been away, but it's like the other one.
Charles, the last one possibly was a fight you may not have seen, but it was Ricky Burns against Gonzalez. It was
I did
about
see it.
3 years ago. Yeah, and he just quit for no reason. It made no sense.
You know, I think I disagree. I know what you're saying, and I can see a very, very persuasive case being made. But it looked to me as if around the 7th round, Gonzalez hit the wall. I think he became exhausted. I noticed that his punches, while he was still landing, really had turned into kind of arm punches, and he wasn't. You know, this is a guy who's used to knocking everybody out. I think he became discouraged, and I think that he became exhausted, and I think it was probably real.
They the commentators in the UK at the time, who can never be completely trusted, but they said that essentially Ricky Burns broke his heart because Gonzalez realised he couldn't get rid of him and was tiring very rapidly, and that's obviously a bit over romantic, but it's might have a semblance of truth.
That's a very cinematic way of saying what I think I just tried to say. Yeah. No, I think I agree.
And that is a fantastic note to end on, I think. We've got quite a lot of listeners in Scotland who love Ricky Burns and will be delighted that you don't think...
Yeah. Shit.
Yes, Andy.
Sorry, it's just popped into mind. Charles, just before you go, can I ask your opinion on Muhammad Ali, Liston 2, the Phantom Punch? What's your opinion on that?
Well, okay. I mean, not to drag this on forever, but I know for a fact that both Ali Liston fights were fixed. So, total fixes, both of them.
Well, we can't finish now, Jesus.
I can't believe
that might be worth another appearance in itself. We might have to get back to just talk about those fights because
that's probably one of the biggest kind of fixed talking points, and I can't believe it. We've just brought it up right at the end. It just popped into my head right there. I can't believe that.
Well, I'll tell you what. It's if we like, you know, of course it'd be my pleasure. But we can revisit this. But I actually know about those two fights and can talk about them with real authority because it turns out that one of the people involved in them was Al Braverman, who was Liston's, basically the person who was sent with Liston as a kind of watchdog for the people who were making the bets. So I know about this stuff very directly.
That's the perfect cliffhanger to go to a part 2 in a future episode there. That is just absolutely brilliant.
Well, yeah, Charles, if you don't mind, I think if you don't mind coming back on again in the future, if you're happy to talk about them now, we could finish on them. But I think maybe it might warrant a bit of a more in-depth discussion. And I'm just wary that our listeners will have been. We're almost at 2.5 hours, and they'll be flagging. And it's not to do with you; it's purely to do with our languorous style, I suppose.
I think the languor comes from this end. It's an age thing. No, let's keep. If you'll have me back, I'd be thrilled to talk about those two fights.
Okay, that would be fantastic. We'll get you back on very soon. And I just want to say thank you. Everyone who's been listening live has been singing your praises and saying how fascinating it is. So I really hope we can get you back on to talk more about the dark arts, I suppose.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me. This was just great fun, and it was great spending time with you guys.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot for that.
Thank you very much, Charles.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time, Charles.